So, what happens when a person's own mind turns against them and it leads to a terrible accident? Who's responsible? Who pays for the damage? Today, we're diving into a legal case that forces us to look at this tough intersection of mental health, personal responsibility, and the sometimes cold, hard logic of the law. I mean, really think about that for a second. If your actions aren't being guided by your own rational thoughts, if you're in a very real way not yourself, are you still on the hook for the consequences? This is the incredibly difficult puzzle we're going to piece together today. The case that throws this question right in our faces is called Dunnage versus Randall. And it's so important to remember that behind all the legal terms, this is, at its heart, a tragic family story. A moment of crisis that really challenged one of the most fundamental ideas in negligence law. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the human story, what actually happened. Then, we'll get into the legal headache it created. We're going to unpack the key legal rule at the center of it all, this idea of an objective standard, before we get to the court's final decision, and finally, talk about why this one case still matters so much today. All right, first up, the tragic incident, because before we can even begin to understand the law here, we have to understand the people involved and the awful personal cost of what happened. And look, the facts of this are just harrowing. A man named Vince was visiting his nephew, Mr. Dunnage. But, completely unknown to his family, Vince was in the grips of a sudden and severe schizophrenic episode. In a state of intense paranoid delusion, he poured petrol over himself and set himself on fire. His nephew, Mr. Dunnage, acted heroically, trying to save him, but was badly burned in the attempt. Tragically, Vince died from his injuries. So, out of this horrifying event, this massive legal question emerges. Where on earth does responsibility lie when rational thought has completely left the building? The injured nephew, Mr. Dunnage, ended up bringing a claim against his late uncle's insurance for his injuries. And the two sides were worlds apart. On the one hand, the claimant, the nephew, argued that his uncle's physical actions, striking the lighter, setting the fire, directly caused his injuries. The harm was real, no matter what was going on in his uncle's head. But on the other hand, the uncle's estate argued that Vince had zero rational control. His mind had essentially been hijacked by his illness. So how could you possibly hold him to the same standard as a reasonable person when he was so profoundly unwell? To answer that, the court had to go right back to basics, to the very foundation of negligence law. And that foundation is built on something called an objective standard. So it all starts with this idea called the duty of care. It's pretty simple, really. It's the basic rule that we all have a responsibility to not do things that could foreseeably hurt someone else. In this case, it was pretty clear an uncle visiting his nephew owed him a duty of care. That part wasn't really up for debate. But that brings us to the standard of care. And folks, this is where the entire case was fought. This was the real battleground. The question wasn't if he owed a duty, but what was the standard he should be judged by? And here is the absolute key. The law of negligence uses what's called an objective test. It asks, what would a reasonable person have done? It doesn't ask, what would a reasonable person with schizophrenia have done? The standard is impersonal. It's a fixed measuring stick that's meant to be consistent for everyone, because the law's priority is protecting the public, not adjusting for every individual's internal state. So, faced with this tragic story and these really strict legal ideas, what did the court decide? Well, this was a huge decision, and the reasoning behind it is powerful. The Court of Appeal did not mince words. This is a direct quote from the judgment. The courts have consistently and correctly rejected the notion that the standard of care should be adjusted to take account of personal characteristics of the defendant. Wow, the message could not be clearer. So there it is. The verdict came in. The court found Vince Randall's estate liable for the injuries to his nephew. Even with his profound mental illness, in the eyes of the civil law, he was held responsible. It's a ruling that really highlights a difficult choice the legal system has to make. So let's break down their logic. It went like this. 1. Yes, a duty of care was owed. 2. That duty was broken because, setting yourself on fire is not something a reasonable person would do. 3. The court said a defendant's mental state doesn't change that standard unless their condition completely removes any physical control. Think like an unexpected heart attack while driving. And 4, because Vince was still physically in control of his body, lighting the lighter, pouring the petrol, even if his mind wasn't rational, he was liable.
Now, you might be thinking this is just one sad, isolated case, but its impact is huge. It clarifies a really murky area of law, and it brings up some big questions for all of us.
So let's just boil this down to the key takeaways. First, the standard of care is objective, period. Second, having a mental illness, even a very severe one, doesn't just give you a free pass in negligence cases. Third, and this is so important, the law's main goal in these situations is to make sure the injured person gets compensated for their loss. And finally, it draws a line between legal liability and moral blame. The court wasn't saying Vince was a bad guy. It was saying that when someone gets hurt, the system is built to focus on fixing that harm, not on judging the character of the person who caused it. Which leaves us with this final, really challenging question. By focusing so much on compensating the victim, does the law get the balance right? Is this a fair, if kind of harsh, system that protects all of us? Or does it fail to show enough compassion for people whose actions are driven by an illness that's totally outside their control? It's a tough one, with no easy answer. And it's the question that this case forces us all to think about.